Well, it's all gone very quiet.
They're all preparing. Nobody wants to say anything bad in case you get caught on YouTube.
Yeah, it's confirmation that we're live, and then we can go ahead with the meeting.
We didn't have an agenda for today, did we?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. All right.
I'll forward it to Mr. Bill just after the presentation. That is the agenda. So.
All right.
On the public website as well.
Of the Flooding Route Scrutiny Review Panel, due to current circumstances, all members and officers are joining online, and the meeting is being streamed live on YouTube and will be available for viewing after. As always, can I please ask members to use the raised hand function and not the chat facility to indicate. So the first item of business is to elect a chairman for the duration of the review. Do I have any nominations?
I'd nominate Maggie.
Oh.
Okay.
I'll second Maggie.
Well, that's very kind of you, gentlemen.
Were you expecting that?
No, I wasn't actually.
Is that agreed by everyone?
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Perfect. Over to you, Mr. Wright.
Okay, is that over to me?
Yes.
Right, so we've done item 1, which was the election of chairman, which was very unexpected, I must admit. So item 2, declarations of interest in respect of items on the agenda. Does anybody have any interest?
Yes, Madam Chairman. I've been involved with the Flood Authority and Severn Trent and a whole range of different organisations now. The implication being the Appleby's flood work, and there's a whole programme going on, and obviously there may be a chance to talk about that later, but I'm just saying that I am aware and I have been involved with the authority, and that's my declaration. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Harrison. Anybody else, any declarations? No? Okay. So moving on to item 3, which is conduct of scrutiny review panels. So is somebody taking us through that, Ian? Is that over to you?
Oh, I think that'll be over to me if I just...
Okay, thank you.
So really, this goes to all the scrutiny review panels. It just sets out the procedure for conducting this panel in predominantly public session. So gathering information such as the presentation we received today will be in public using YouTube live stream. Gathering evidence for witnesses will be done in private. Though obviously a record of that session would of course be given in the usual way, 3 minutes. I don't have anything to add on this unless anyone has any comments. It's pretty standard with all the scrutiny review panels.
Could I ask how many sessions are we intending to meet for? And is the last session the one where we where obviously we formulate what we're going to send to the Scrutiny Commission? Is that the process? Yeah,
so in the next report kind of sets out a bit about the work plan. So basically, at the moment, the plan is to have 5 meetings. We'll have this meeting, the next meeting to gather information, and then hopefully the third meeting will be getting evidence from witnesses, and then the final 2 will be about drafting the report and outcomes, and then kind of looking at the final report. That would then go to the Environment and Transport Scrutiny Committee, and then finally to Cabinet. But it is a flexible plan. We wouldn't want it to kind of carry on forever. Do want to have a bit of an end date.
Okay, yeah. Thank you. Does anybody else have any questions on item 3, the conduct of the scrutiny review panel, before we move on to the next item? No? Okay, so item 4, scoping document and work programme. So is that over to you, Ian?
It might be easy if I just quickly.
Soon, Chair, soon.
I will get it right. 3rd time lucky.
Yeah, Kat, would you like to talk through there?
Yeah, so this has previously been agreed by the Environment and Transport Chair and spokes, as well as the Scrutiny Commissioners. It just sets out the scope of the flooding scrutiny review panel, as well as like the work programme following the significant flooding events in October and November last year. So we can kind of consider the council's role as the lead local flood authority and its links with other risk management authorities. The draft work programme is also set out. I wasn't really going to say much about it because in Ian's presentation it does go into discussion about the kind of the future meetings and maybe kind of what members would like to see. But I would be welcome to take any comments or queries.
Any comments or queries? No? Okay, so I'll get this one right now. So item 5, flood presentation. So I'm assuming that is you, Ian. Thank you.
Yes, it is, Chair. Thank you very much. Kat, will you be sharing the slides?
Yes, yeah, do that now.
Okie dokie, if you could do, please. And thank you, Chair. So what we put together in the presentation here, and which I'll go through in a moment, is really that high-level themes to start setting that understanding and knowledge that then you can use the further sessions to inform us what you'd like to know more about, because I'd very much like this to be an interactive process. We were conducting reviews before COVID-19 happened anyway in how we manage water in Leicestershire and other authorities. So the thoughts of this scrutiny panel will be really welcome in that. So starting off, do you want me to tell you when I want them clicking over, Kat, or do you want to give me control?
You should be able to take control if that's easier.
Oh yeah, I got it. Yep, that works. Sorry, we're all still getting used to the technology. Before I start, can I introduce 2 of my colleagues, some of which you already know. So I have Lee Quincy here as well, who is the Head of Service for Network Management in the Environment and Transport branch, underneath which Flood sits. And I also have Jamie Needham, who is the team manager for our infrastructure improvements team, of which Flood sits inside that team, and he works for Lee. The reason I brought Jamie and Leah along, 1, they can experience the Scrutiny Commission, but 2, if we have any of that high level knowledge that I may not have, because I'm a bit long in the tooth sometimes, Jamie and Lee can help with that. And also they'll be coming along to help put together the further presentations and information for yourself. So I thought it was best if they hear what you're wanting to know more about, so we can basically make those sessions as good as possible. Kat, Chair, how would you like to deal with questions as I go through?
I think, would you like to do the presentation first and then we'll ask questions afterwards? I think that would probably be better if you do each session first, and then if there's a relevant pause, that would be really good, Ian, please. Absolutely.
Thank you very much, Chair. Okay, and you'll also notice as well, we haven't got any of my colleagues along from our drainage function, which sits in Highways Ops, because I felt that was the level of detail that we got down for the next meeting. And of course, if you want us to any specific data on that, we can bring along the relevant people to talk to you there as well. We have also brought previously papers to Environment and Transport Overview and Scrutiny regarding drainage and other matters, so we can refer back to those as well. Okay, so as you'll see for the presentation here, we have been experiencing more increasing frequency and significance of weather events back end of last year, but also previously. October and November we had specific ones, but also into this year in February and June as well, and I'll come on to those. We did take a paper to the Environment and Transport Scrutiny Committee in January regarding that, and they felt they really wanted to review, because this was becoming such a growing matter, to do this scrutiny panel. And they really wanted to understand, which is what I'm going to try and talk you through at the high level today, is there's still what can be considered, and I must agree, quite complicated ways that water is handled across the country, and the reasons why we now are where we are, and our role as the lead local flood authority, which sounds a very grand title, but unfortunately doesn't come with much powers and budgets as we'd like to actually achieve. So we'll tell you what we can and can't do as we go through. And our links with other risk management authorities. It's a grand way of saying people like Severn Trent, the Environment Agency, other people who have a vested interest in water because they're managing the risk. So we have a good relationship with those bodies, and that's much improved over the last few years. However, you know, there is a perceived problem regarding accountability, because quite often people are only really interested in flood when they're actually being flooded or about to be flooded, or it's raining a lot. And that's where it can be seen in that emergency response. It can be seen quite disorganised on who has to actually take charge and do various functions to stop properties being flooded and that concern. So what I want to go through is there also, and I'll talk about the our lead local flood authority's new responsibility for local planning authorities, and the lack of actual influence we have as the county council in the recommendations that we set out in, say, a section 19 investigation, which is when a property has been flooded. We can only make recommendations, we can't insist and force, which is quite a difficult thing for all people to understand. So to clarify the role of the county council, we are a lead local flood authority as well as the highway authority. Okay, so what we do is we consider the effectiveness, what the purpose of this review was to consider the effectiveness of existing processes. So our response to planning applications, and it's interesting to know that we have only been responsible for replying to planning applications since 2015. Before that, it was the Environment Agency. And many of the new housing estates that have been built that were flooded in some of the recent events, we unfortunately weren't the people who commented on them. Also want to consider the effectiveness of highways drainage, how flooding events are responded to, and Section 19 investigations. And also to understand more the development and role of sustainable drainage systems called SUDs, which often now appear in new housing estates. Now, those sections there are what we were going to talk about at the next meeting, but I'll come on that at the end. We also wanted then to Scrutiny Commission to consider the lessons learned and how we could help minimise future impacts, which is the role of the lead local flood authority and its strategy, and to help manage expectations for preventing flooding events, including extreme weather events. So that's what we were going to go through.
Ian, would you mind pausing there? Because we have two questions.
Of course,
Mr.
Chair.
Sheehan first and then Mr. Harrison. So Sean, if you would like to go ahead with your question.
Yeah, thanks. I think it would be helpful for the next meeting to have a chart of the staffing in the department so that we can see who sits where, what the responsibilities are, what the relationships are to each other, and how it connects in with like the highways drainage people, and also the external agencies like Severn Trent and Environment Agency, for example, just so we can see the size and structure of the department and understand how it works, how it operates, and where you need to come in at one level and how that might be escalated up to another, so we can understand how it functions or should function.
I think that's, Chair, if that's okay, I think that's an excellent suggestion. Yeah. We have got those charts because we've been looking at them ourselves and how things work, but it'd be very good to receive your opinions on how you think those relationships manage. So thank you, Councillor Sheena.
Thank you. Mr. Harrison?
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, I've had experience where, Ian, it was a jumbled up mess to begin with, but over a period of time, it's now becoming what I would describe as a really fantastic success, if not a showcase. We've got landowners involved because they're critical, and particularly upstream. We've got, particularly talking of Appleby, people now who are prepared to allow land to be flooded and the public to use it as well. It's the parish council. And it's how you go about the parish council, because I had 2 meetings when we were real helmet jobs, you know, but we got through it. Severn Trent was another person who was absolutely so robust. He's no longer doing that role now, thank goodness. And DEFRA was important. I've put the county councillor down because I think that's important that he or she is involved as early as possible. The public involvement is important because trying to harness their power and goodwill. In this particular project at Appleby, we've had members of the public going out with saws and chopping up block trees and blocking the streams and all sorts. And then obviously we've worked really, really well with the district council. That's North West Leicestershire District Council. And I think it's how we build these relationships at an early stage. So we have to know who all these people are to be able to have this interaction in the way that I think is vital. I have said before that Andrew Smallwood has been excellent and had a long conversation again with him this morning. And he is utterly inspired in how he can take this forward. And he was saying that he's been approached now to talk to a greater number of an audience to sort of look at how this is going. In the early stages, Ian, I had to remind Severn Trent that they had a charter to comply with and they have a duty of care to the public. And that's me as a council being able to talk to them with that language. And bit by bit, it's been such a massive learning curve. But if we know a procedure of how to handle this, who we need to talk to, the farmers, the parish council, and we have some methodology of trying to do it nice and gentle and not have have the battles, we've overcome them all. But I mean, it'd be so lovely to be able to think we had systems that could flow, and not flow's probably not the right word, but systems that would work better anyway. So thank you, Madam Chairman, but I think it's critical that we have a formula, that we know who we need to knock on doors, who we need to talk to quickly, because this escalates and the longer it goes, the angrier they become. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Harrison. Mr. Parton, you have your hand raised.
Thank you. Ian, at the beginning of the presentation, am I right in saying that you said that Leicestershire County Council is the lead partner in terms of flooding in the county?
So we are the lead local authority, and that's a very grand title, but we are responsible for managing the risk of flooding. We're not responsible for sorting. And what I will do through the presentation then is talk you through, dispel some of the myths. And as Councillor Harrison has said then, paint the picture of all the different bodies that have to work together in a constructive way in order to manage the risk of flooding. Yeah. So hopefully the presentation will talk you through that at the highest level. And and Mr. Harrison's obviously been involved for quite a long while because he has some areas that do get wet. This has been an evolution which I'll talk you through from dating back to the floods of 2007 and the Wright report. So I'll talk you through how it's grown and how really you reviewing how we can do now. I think we're at the next evolution level of how we can make it better. I remember standing at the some of the district forums a while ago and producing out actually what you do when you're either stood in water, about to stand in water, or think you may stand in water at some point in the future, and who different agencies are responsible for that. And it's that sort of clear communications, the role of flood wardens, the role of our comms, the role of flood management is really important. So this being reviewed now, and I'll come on to our strategy, will be really useful in how we then move forward. As our role has grown, as the management of the flood risk has grown over the last 5 years, will really be what I would like back from yourselves as councillors to really give that recommendation.
Okay, thank you, Ian. Just before we move on, one question from myself. I've got a particular problem in my area, which is Stony Stanton, and one thing around it is the Section 19 investigations. I think members of the public particularly put a lot of what's the word?
Store in that. Exactly,
and it's really understanding what a Section 19 is. So perhaps we can highlight that as we go through. So please continue with the presentation, and we'll run through a couple more slides, and then we'll take questions again.
Ian, could I just raise something here? If we're listing issues that are of concern to us, could I raise the flooding of rear gardens? This has been a consistent problem in Coventry Road in Hinckley, and I've had many discussions over the years, and it never really goes away, and it's never really very clear who is responsible. I think it's third parties actually who have caused it. If we could add that to the list of issues that we'll be tackling, it'd be useful.
So, Chair, if it's okay, I think many of the things that the members are really interested in there is what's been identified for the next session. So this is good that we're knowing where you want to home into. So, for example, flooding events, until you actually start learning about flood, there are many reasons why flooding happens. Is it groundwater coming up? Is it fluvial? Is it pluvial? Off the roads, out of rivers? just general level. So I think giving you more information about that, and if we can get some out beforehand, will really help your understanding, which will then help you make recommendations for how we can do this different, better, and so forth.
Yeah. So if you would like to continue, because I'm conscious seeing that you've got about 20 slides here, so we'll try and let you get through the majority of them before we pause for questions again. But if members would like to raise their hands, then we can take questions as we go, but try and get through the majority of the slides before we stop again. Thank you.
Okay, so as we were talking about there, we've almost led ourselves through the proposed outcomes we actually wanted from you, that were agreed by the commissioners, was for yourselves to understand the role and remit of the council as the lead local flood authority, and as the highway authority itself, because we have two duties there, and how they interact, and your comments on those will be really useful in relation to flooding and to the extent of the resources we have to undertake our roles. I think resources will be, especially as Councillor Sheenan wanted us to paint there, the actual resources we have and what we were given with the new duties and how it's grown over the last 5 years are quite difficult because they're quite stretched, but we quite paint that picture for you in an honest way. So also, as Councillor Harrison said, understanding the roles of other agencies in relation to flooding events, but also the management of water and the risk of flooding. So clearer working relationships with our partners, you talked about that as well across Leicestershire, and then all of that to be provided in recommendations and actions to improve current practice, accountability, engagement, effectiveness. All the things that you've said to us there are what basically the Scrutiny Commissioner said we should be looking at. The good thing is the timing of this, although the timing of the floods was bad, we are actually now at the point where we'll be starting the refresh of the flooding strategy across Leicestershire. It's done every 6 years, and it was 5 years ago when it was last done. So all of this will help us feed into that flood strategy, which will then go out to wider consultation to the public, update a new work action plan, and then also feed in, going to Cabinet and sign off. So this is really well-timed commission, which will hopefully really give us some direction and steer. So thanks for that, and I'll now give you a history lesson in flooding, as I understand it from when I came involved in 2015. So you may remember those big floods we had in 2007, really, really devastating. And it was some of the first big events we'd seen for many years, especially down south. And the government commissioned reviews in that, which ended up in something quite substantial, which was called the PIT review in 2008, which actually led to an act of Parliament, which is the Flood and Water Management Act. So that established Leicestershire as the lead local flood authority, say grand title, and it gave us some specific powers and duties. The main thing here being the coordinating the management of local flood risk. It's not for us to do, it's for us to coordinate everyone else to do. That's why we have to do, like Mr. Harrison said, talk nicely and get everyone to do things cooperatively. So what we're responsible for, though, is what we're not responsible for. So we're responsible for the flood risk from local sources, so ordinary water courses, which are very small ditches, very small streams, and very small rivers, and surface water runoff and overland runoff and groundwater, which is what Mr. Bill may have been on around in back gardens in Leicestershire. But what we're not responsible for, which is the Environment Agency, is the main rivers. So they're the ones that often break their banks, such as the Soar, such as the Trent, and then they flood. That's the responsibility of the Severn Trent. There were also further changes to the National Planning Policy Framework. We were members aware of what the NPPF has. It's normally to link with development, but it also brings in the role of flood, whereby Leicestershire County Council, in its role as the legal local flood authority, became a statutory consultee, like we are on the highways in the planning process. So we're a statutory consultee, and we have been since the 15th of April. Those are quite important things, because one of the things you wanted to consider was our role in the planning process, and we can tell you more about that and what actually, a bit like in highways planning, what we can and can't say, what we can advise refusal on or not. So we can cover that in the next session if you wish us to. Because I think one of the things that came out of the events was some areas were seeing flooding on new housing estates, and it's those roles and responsibilities for those housing estates and what's being built that was asking a lot of questions. Okay, so here's a list of the bodies, and I say you've got the presentation, you can also read the strategy, but starting at the top, sorry, I was getting some feedback then. Sorry about that, Chair. We have the Department for Farming and Rural Affairs, which basically is the lead for flood and coastal erosion, as it says there. They're the highest government body. And under them, we have the regional flood and coastal committees. So the Ministry of Housing and Communities and Local Government sets out the planning policy and framework. And as you know, they're just consulting on some changes to the National Planning Policy and Framework, which could have impact on flooding and its response in consultations, as well as highways and other matters as well. So moving down, we then have the Environment Agency under DEFRA, which has that strategic overview of all flooding, of the main rivers, the coastal erosion, and those the regional flood coastal committees. Okay, we then have the district and borough councils, as we're a two-tier authority, and they're often the first response for flooding events. That's non-statutory, but districts and boroughs are often the first response in emergency incidences. They also have duties under the Land Drainage Authority, as a land drainage authority. We then have the water and sewage companies such as Severn Trent and Anglia Water. So they manage flood risk from their supplies, reservoirs. And in case you didn't know, there are over 30 reservoirs across Leicestershire and Rutland, which when you think of what happened in Derbyshire recently, makes you read the management of those quite closely. And they're also, so they look after reservoirs, and then obviously the pipes, public sewage, drainage systems, and often what we see in flooding events is those interacting with drainage or groundwater or rivers that are overflowing. So you can have a number of agencies involved. There is ourselves as the Highway Authority, and our functions there are providing and managing the highway drainage systems. We have Highways England, who are also the Highway Authority across Leicestershire for the strategic road network with the same responsibilities. And we actually also have an internal drainage board, but that sits up in the very top of northwest Leicestershire and deals with the part of the Trent Valley, as you can imagine, an area that's high risk of flooding and is dealt with by its own board. Just to say that we have three RFCCs, the Trent side, the Anglican Northern and the Severn and Wye, and I'll come on to those in a bit more detail later. And our key role is to establish the coherent of those is to establish coherent plans for managing the flood risk. Okay, they promote efficient and risk-based investment. So we have to pay into these flood boards approximately £300,000 a year, and we can bid for monies back out as other authorities can do to actually do flood remedial schemes. And they provide a link between all the bodies to manage water across the country far better. So, okay, sorry, I was confusing my two slides there. So these are about the regional flood and coastal committees, as I've just talked through. So we've got Trent, the Anglican Northern and the Severn and Wye. And if you have a look at this map, as you can see, the majority of Leicestershire sits in the Trent. That's where we pay the majority of our money into, and it's a majority of where our flooding instances happen. But we also have the Anglican and Northern, and we also have the Severn and Wye down here. The blue dots.
Sorry, Ian, to interrupt. Do you have a map showing? Because we have no map at the moment. We're still on slide 6. Okay,
sorry, has something gone wrong with the slides? I'm on the map at the moment, slide 8.
No, well, I'm on slide 6. I don't know about any other members.
On the screen, I can see an icon that says to presenter 8.
Yes.
Oh, okay. Oh, it keeps jumping around. Sorry, I wondered why you were looking at me when I was talking about the RFCCs and the slide was wrong. It was right on mine.
Better. Map's up now. Thank you.
Okay. The interesting thing is, Kat, I can't actually move the slides on anymore either.
I just have to change it so participants can't move it on themselves.
Oh, right, okay.
Control again.
Sorry, say that again, Kat.
Are you able to take control again, or do you want me to?
Is that okay? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got the map up at the moment. Sorry, as I was talking, sorry about that. The slides didn't, as I moved over the presentation there, but we talked about the RFCCs. So as you can see, the majority of us are sat in the blue area, which is the Trent. We then also have the Severn and Wye down south, and we have the Anglican and Northern to the right. Interestingly, you've got the reported incidents as blue dots. And as you can see, although you would expect them to follow the rivers, they don't. We have lots of areas that receive lots of incidents of flooding or groundwater or others, depending on how the weather's been and the flash storms and the cumulative impacts we've had. Kat, can you move it on? Because I can't. Okay, so wanted to give you a quick overview, just to give you that background of what happened in the past 12 months. So we've had a number of significant storm events, and the October and November ones were detailed in the link there of the Scrutiny report, which led to us discussing here. But in February, we had the 3 named storms. So we had Ciara, Dennis, and then George, which led to a great deal of water flowing around Leicestershire, and we experienced levels of flooding we've not seen before in areas we'd also not seen it before. So we were getting torrential rain, consistent rain over a long period, which led to many different events. As I say, Northwest Leicestershire and Charnwood took the brunt of all that, but we had other areas down south around Stony Stanton and others where we had some very specific, I think it was quoted, I've forgotten, it was a month's worth of rain in how many hours, but that happened all over the country as well. Can you move that on if that's okay? Kat? Okay, and this gives you just some of the details of the properties flooded and the incidents we've had. Should just point out, quite often we get the same inquiries from multiple places, so the numbers can seem quite large, but people might report a road flooded as well as a house flooded. Interestingly as well, people don't tell us about when their properties have been flooded or nearly flooded, because that can have impact on their insurance or their liability as riparian owners for not having done their duties that other people could claim on. So while we might get things double reported, we also don't get told other. And of course, as all things, evidence is really useful for us for managing the risk and where we have to do things. Ted, did you want to ask a question there?
Quickly, please, Ian. The data at the first headline figure is storms Ciara, Dennis and George.
Yeah. Properties
flooded 90. Is it possible to break those down? Because that would tell us whether every time there is a bad storm, a certain amount of flooding happens, or whether one of the 3 was particularly worse than the others, which would indicate that there's a tipping point of level of rain that causes it, or whether it's a consistent, every time there's a bad storm, there's flooding. Thank you.
Okay, so we can break that down by the data we're given. I say very reliant on what we're given. We do have our areas that always flood, that sit in those high risk areas, and those are the ones we work with about property flood protection, because sometimes there's just not something you can do if you live near that area. There are others where we actually just have, because of the nature of the rain as it came, or because there were blockages in highway drainage or Severn Trent's network or other things, we just had first time we'd never had properties flooded before, and then it just happened. So it was a very mixed picture. What we then do with the investigations is then looking into the investigation. I'll come on to this in a moment, but why did that flood happen? And they can either be really easy sometimes to do. It's because there was a lot of rain, the river burst its banks, and these properties flooded. That's very simple. And we know the investigation is to come to the conclusion of why it happened and then remedials or not. Quite often, though, you're looking at a cumulative set of impacts from rain, from gullies, from road, from Severn Trent, from other things, riparian owners. And you have to do quite a thorough investigation to get to the answer of why did this happen and what could you do about stopping it in the future. It can be very complicated and can take several years to actually find out the reasons why. And you have to then get into some very detailed modelling. So it all varies, Ted, unfortunately. It's art is the application of science in this case for flood, but I'm sure some of my colleagues can come on and give you more detail about the Section 19 investigations at the next meeting. Okay, can you move on again, please, Kat? Okay, so in February, that was the main flooding map we have there. As you can see, some of the normal culprits we've got down the Soar Valley Way. If you can see that down, I'm sorry, I'm moving my mouse, but you can't see it, so that's a bit stupid. Down the Soar Valley Way, coming down from Loughborough and so forth, around the areas of Bredon where we normally, but then we had many instances over in areas we've never seen it before. You move on, please, Kat. And then in June, as you can see, June, some very heavy rainfalls, and that was in completely separate areas we've never seen before as well. So what we're starting to see now, and which we want to reflect in our new strategy, is we're not having events like we had 5 years ago. We're now having different sort of water events, and we need to actually be different on how we deal with them, both in the emergency and in the mitigating their risk. Kat, if you can move that on, please. Okay, so giving you some of our duties and understanding ours. So as the lead local flood authority, so I'm sorry, just for those who can't remember, the FWMA was the Floodwater Management Act. So we have a number of sections there where we prepare and maintain a strategy for local flood risk management of Leicestershire, which we did in 2015, and it's up for renewal after 6 years, because water is quite a long-term thing. And you can not have instances for many years or not. So it's over a 6-year period as we have to do it. So that's why the timing's well now. Maintaining a register of our assets that are physical features, a significant effect on flooding. We are actually doing an awful lot of work at the moment about our whole risk-based approach to asset management because of the way our budgets are now from the government having stopped a lot of funding. We don't know a lot about a lot of our assets in Leicestershire because historically, some of these were built many hundreds of years ago. We don't know what's under some of the ground, and especially when it comes to drainage and water, a lot of it is hidden. So we are putting together plans in our new strategy for how we will deal with getting the assets and the high value assets that need to be well maintained because they have an impact on flooding, which get the most resource. So that's one of a part of our new plan going forward. And then we have the section 19, as you said there. I mean, the key point where we carry out investigations. Under our current strategy, it says we will investigate under a section 19 if one property has been flooded. So one property 5 years ago was quite an instance to happen. Unfortunately, in the last couple of years, one actually means we do many, many investigations, and actually should we be concentrating where we have higher numbers first, unfortunately. But the key point there, as Ted picked up earlier, is we do not have a duty to implement a solution, and we actually don't get any funding to implement a solution. But what we try and do is lead the other people to actually come up with solutions, and we will try and solve things and bid for money. But we actually get no distinct money from the government for flooding. We have to bid for what we do. You move the slides on, please, Kat.
Ian, could I just ask a question
Of course
there?
you can, Chair.
We were talking about assets and you know what's underground and everything. I'm taking it is our responsibility to maintain those assets, is it?
So there are different assets, Chair. So we have our own assets where we're responsible for so the drainage asset, certain ditches, certain things we've adopted. But then there are many responsibilities such as Severn Trents or the riparian owners, which can play a part. And are those assets ours, or do we want to maintain them on the risk register because they're important? Because if they're not well maintained, such as sluice gates and other things, then they can have an impact on flooding. So it's quite a complicated, and when you think, I think we have over 130, nearly 140,000 culverts across Leicestershire. There are an awful lot of assets out there.
Thank you.
So that's something we can explore at the next meeting if you want to, Chair.
I think that would be good. And I think Sean has a question just before we move on.
Of course.
Thank you, Ian.
Thank you, Chair. I think
No.
There we go.
Try again.
Right, it's just a bit touchy, that one is. When you said you were going to talk about the history of flooding, Ian, I thought you might start with Noah's Ark, because that's a story that people were told from a very early age. And of course, the story goes that after it was all over, the people were promised, the survivors, that it wouldn't happen again. I'm afraid that people have got this inbuilt expectation that if there's a flood, something will be done to prevent it happening again. And I think this is what you're up against, really. People don't like to see flooding happening again. Again, they think something's wrong. And I just wonder if this risk-based strategy, risk-based approach, is the correct one. Because I don't think you can ever really succeed with that. You know that something's going to flood. If something has flooded, it will flood again at some time in the future. And I think in terms of influencing other bodies, other agencies, a risk-based approach, I'll put it to you that it's not the most effective or politically wise way of approaching things. And I think the strategy should be more based on prevention. And you should be investigating things more and trying to get more response from the people that have got the resources to do something about it. That seems an idea.
Okay, so I think the risk-based approach, I would disagree, I think is the right way of dealing, because it's an evidence-based approach, or the risk of things happening. It's how you then deal with the risk that you've identified. So it shouldn't always be about bringing in a flood defence. It shouldn't always be about bringing in, SUDs or other mitigations. It shouldn't always be about property protection. What you've done is, once you've identified the risk you've got, you then try and look at what is the best approach to deal with that risk. And that could, as I say, could fall from, there's nothing you can actually do to stop properties flooding. So how do you prevent them flooding? So property protection, all the way through to some very big, which, as you've said, the public screen for when they've been flooded, which is flood defences. Well, flood defences just channel water to other places. There are many, many different approaches that you then do based on the risks you've identified. And of course, the problem you've got is lots of people are experiencing issues with water. If you only have a certain amount of resource, how do you decide where that money goes? So that's what the risk-based approach does as well, based on the evidence.
Well, evidence-based working is fine, but I think the problem with this approach is that you set out all your risks and then you look at which you can tolerate. And I think it becomes a recipe for inaction. And I think we should be doing more to identify problems and then really pushing it for preventive work to stop floods happening before they ever occur.
Yeah, and as you know, Sean, what you have to do is live within the resources we've got. So we don't have finite resources. For example, in my role, I have to manage risks across road safety, the normal asset we've got, walking, with some of the things we discussed in a minute. And you have to look across your whole asset and what you're dealing with and decide where you're best to spend your money in the ways that you've described. But maybe that's something we'll explore more. Obviously, we're working to a national government set criteria under the Act from Parliament. So how we apply that, though, will be interesting to have your thoughts.
Yeah, well, we'll continue with this discussion as we go on, I think.
I'm sure we will. Okay.
Dan just has a question for Ian before we move on.
Very briefly, I concur with Ian's thoughts. One man's rains, another man's floods. We have to look at risk because that's how you calculate things. But to help Sean think a little more about this, in Appleby now we're looking at telemetry. So people will get warnings where they know there's flood risks and they'll be able to bring it up on their phone and have a picture and everything else. So the intelligence and the technical side is moving forward. Obviously, we're all governed by funding, but we always have to go back that we are the people trying to guide people and open doors and create communications amongst a group of people. So, we've always got to remember what our job is and how we go forward. We can't be a gift to every man, unfortunately. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so if you're okay with you, Chair, I'll continue on some of our other duties. So we also have Section 23 under the Land Drainage Act, where basically this is about developers wanting to culvert a ditch or change pipes and so forth. We are a statutory consultee on major developments, a major development being 10 or more dwellings or an area over 1 hectare of planning applications. And I've just come in here. This is an area that since 2015, and I remember when the duty first came to us and the government were thinking about making us the actual planning authority for it, but that was given to the local planning authorities and being a 2-tier. So that went to the districts and we became a consultee. We started off by only getting about 60 or 70 applications to comment on in the first year or so. We're now up to well over 1,000 a year that we comment on. And we also play a part in emergency planning, which is something people become very interested in water when you're actually standing in it, which we do under the Leicestershire and Rutland Prepared Partnership, whereby that's the coordination of actual responses to emergency situations. And our role in there is we basically support others, and then our officers try and get in there, as some of you will realise when we have the meetings immediately afterwards. we're in there almost as part of the recovery of trying to understand why it happened, and then doing the Section 19 reports and various other things to try and see how we can, one, prevent it from happening again, or two, how you can protect yourself against it. But that comes down to the Section 19 reports. I'll just make another comment there that isn't on, because I'm not sure where I can do this up later. One of the interesting things that's happened since 2015, when these new duties started coming over to authorities, and it's what Sean said about again earlier, when we talked you through the staffing levels, we've probably had the turning of our flood staff twice in the last 5 years. If anyone stays longer than a year, then we've done very well. And the reason for that is because these skills suddenly became very needed for planning, development, dealing with water and flood, consultancies and other areas were able to go for that very limited resource of people who are knowledgeable about water and flood and actually take them away from local authorities. So we've struggled to maintain our staff for many years. We actually had to bring in a market premium across a number of areas, but we now actually have a stable flood team where we've actually kept them in place now for over a year, and we're actually now looking at, okay, how can we build on the work of having that team in place? So we've really had to pay a heavy price for consultants to actually do a lot of our work because we couldn't have the staff in place. So that's probably something you want to explore more when you see the actual numbers of staff we have. There has been a complete shortage of flood specialists around the country, and they've commanded a high premium, which has made this quite a tricky area of work. Okay, can you move on, please, Kat? Okay, so the non-statutory duties, we also do, and we get asked to respond to minor planning applications, especially when we know there's evidence of a flooding concern in that area. So the planning authorities or others could ask us to look at something. We develop and implement a programme of flood resilience schemes, such as we've talked about. I say we don't have that role to do, but we look to do it because we're that lead. And we investigate the cause of flooding incidents, the Section 19s, even when they don't trigger a statutory investigation, but those are becoming more and more, and we don't have the resource now to actually do all of the ones we get. And we have proactive communications with the other people, the other stakeholders, to the members of the public, ensuring the right messages are out there about water, about flood wardens, about, as Councillor Harrison was saying there, how you can find out whether you're at risk of flooding or not and what you can do to help protect yourself. And we also develop and share flooding and drainage best practice. You know, you've seen probably over the last few years a lot of good things coming on the news about upland moorlands, or about using trees, or about using other mitigations. Well, we look to share those whenever we're doing something different as well. Move on, please, Kat. Okay, this one's the one we thought we should put in because it's what we don't do, unfortunately. So there's a misconception because we have that title as lead local flood authority, and we were quoted in the press last year as being the lead local flood authority across the whole of the country because they misquoted us. You can imagine that led to a few phone calls about flooding. You know, we don't have a duty to resolve all flood related matters. So our role is intended to organise the overview across all the other bodies that have something to do. Now, if we think it will help if we step in, we do, but we only have finite resources, finite staff, so we have to be careful where we do that. So while we investigate, we have no obligation to actually sort those things out, which is very hard when you're stood at a parish meeting, as my officers are, only a day or so after people have been flooded, and you're trying to explain them, it's not us, it's someone else who's going to have to do it. It's quite a skilled task to talk people through that when they've just had probably their lives quite disrupted for all the water. So we're not responsible for the maintaining the ordinary watercourses. That actually falls down to the riparian landowner, a title I learned 5 years ago because I didn't realise I was one with the ditch at the bottom of my garden. So riparian landowners is basically if you've got a ditch or a little stream or something else, you're responsible for keeping it clear. Now I know a lot of people think it should be everyone else that does it, but actually it not flooding is very much in your own hands. Quite interestingly, because we're in a statutory consultee in the planning process, we're not responsible for planning enforcement. So whilst we may comment and ask for conditions and other things on planning with regard to flood, like we do the Highway Authority, the enforcement side and how developers build out their sites and install their flood infrastructure is still the responsibility of the planning authority. So quite often we might ask that the ground only gets cleared in a certain way, and if it's not done like that, it's up to the planning authority to make sure that those conditions are stuck to. And I say, responding to emergencies, whilst we start the investigation and the recovery side of looking at why it happened, we're only a supporting player. We look after our own drainage and culverts. We'll have people out trying to help, giving sandbags out and so forth, but we're not the main responder. We support everyone else with our resources. Can you move on, please, Kat? Okay, so we also then have our other duty, which is where you may be interested, and it's on for us to discuss next time, as a highway authority and drainage, because water doesn't stay in one place. It flows between what could almost be considered a flood to highway to Severn Trent and back again. So we have various responsibilities long-standing under the Highways Act about maintaining our sewage system, the drainage systems and so forth. And basically, we also have a section 100 of the Highways Act, which gives us the purpose of draining and preventing surface water flooding. We often see how water can come off adjoining land across the highway, where we have powers to deal with some of that. But of course, it often, where's the water coming from, where's it starting, where's it going to, and who's responsible for each piece of infrastructure can get very complicated. And I think as we talk that through with you at the next meeting, you'll see how dealing with water in a consistent way is probably one of the things we'll want to try and get to, which I think is what you've talked about already. If you could move on, please, Kat. Okay, so giving you a few of the facts about, and we've taken these to scrutiny before, but the roadside drains and channels and gullies, as you can see, 136,000. Just one of those not being maintained properly can lead to problems if you get heavy rain in an area. That's an awful lot. And we've changed the system in the last couple of years on how we do that to give a more risk-based approach, which means we visit the ones that cause problems more, and the ones who don't need it, say on a cul-de-sac in the back of a small housing estate, we don't need to go there every year or every year and a half like we used to. So that's better use of our resource. So we have all those channels, approximately 50,000, that convey the water off the road into a drainage ditch, often called grips. Interestingly enough, coming out, I was reading something the other day, and we'll need to filter this in, down in the Somerset levels, they've done an awful lot of work on maintaining their grips better, and it helps keep the water off the highway and get it into the ditches quicker instead of running down the road. We have ponds and lagoons, loads of inspection chambers, underground culverts. The big thing is there is a lot of drainage under there, which has been passed from the old water boards through into the district councils and now to ourselves, where we do not have extensive knowledge of looking at them. We don't know where they are, basically. What we are doing is looking to map where the worst problems are caused first, so we know more about where the difficult situations are, not just about where everything is. And as you can see there, this is how some of the infrastructure has moved around over the last 20 odd years. And of course, what we want is also detailed plans of everything new that's built as well, which hopefully is forthcoming. Can you move the next slide on, please? I'm nearly there. Okay, so what was discussed and agreed in the past agenda, hopefully that gave you an overview, and you can go back and sort of contemplate some of those. I would suggest reading the flood strategy that went to Cabinet in 2015. But what you said you wanted to look at in more detail at the next meeting was planning applications. So flooding events and how we've dealt with those. I've given you an overview and you've asked for some more detail. Section 19 investigations and the highway drainage side, and also the role of sustainable urban drainage systems. I first came across these in the mid-noughties when I was doing some courses, and I was like, what are these SUD things everyone's on about? But they're really relevant now. So under that, the next meeting then was to examine partnership arrangements, as we talked about. That was going to be meeting 3. Meeting 4 was drafting a report along with the recommendations to talk that through, and meeting 5 was agreeing the publishing of the final report. So swinging back up to the next meeting, apart from what you've already told us to feature into that meeting, or we'll fit in the other parts into the role of the other agencies, is there anything further you'd like us to cover at the next meeting that you've not already talked about, Chair?
I think, Ian, first of all, I mean, you've given us an awful lot of information. I mean, for myself, looking at the presentation, if we could have a copy of the presentation, that would be very useful, so members can go through it. And I know I've probably got some questions probably from reading it again. So probably if we could have a mechanism for either sending to you or through Kat or somebody to get those questions answered, because looking at the agenda for the next time, it looks very meaty and what we've already got. So I think if members can probably have a read through that. I think what would also be useful, as Sean suggested, the roles, the responsibilities, the resources within the team that you already have, because that will really help us to understand where you're coming from and what you're having to deal with. And again, if we could have that before the next meeting, and if members have got any questions, then we can probably, you know, get some questions and answers sent off to you, and we can have the answers before that next meeting. Because as I say, looking at that, I would ask you to go through it, but you know, we're not going to get through that agenda if we do that. So if we could do that. I think as well, you know, you've covered so much, and for me, a lot of it is really expectation and managing expectations, certainly of the public. And I think that's an important thing we've got to get out there, because saying we're the lead authority, it conjures up all sorts of things that really is not there behind backing it up. But so that's where I'd like to go on it. I know I've got a couple of questions from Sean and Ted. So if Sean and Ted could ask their questions.
I think Ted was first, Chair.
Oh, sorry, Ted.
A true gentleman, Sean.
Do try.
Will you succeed? Taking from this, something that would be worth reading, which is something I'll research. I think it's up to individuals, is a lot of the acts you've talked about, Ian. We've got section 23 of the LDA, and then you've given section 100 of Highways Act. But something that would be interesting, could we have maybe 2, possibly 3 examples of section 19 investigations to get a idea of, here's an example of something that happened, and for us to be able to work through the process and think, so in that one, that was the situation, and then look at another one and think, yeah, I'm getting parallels with that other one. Or it might be that there were 2 totally different scenarios being played out. But to get an understanding, and that, but of course, will then feed into what Sean was talking about in terms of roles and responsibilities, because the investigation, well, I've never seen one. I don't know whether any of the other members have, whether in our investigation at this point we then co-opted it to Severn Trent Water, or so-and-so Joe Bloggs from the Environment Agency was then asked. So how possible is that?
I think that's very possible and a good suggestion, if that's all right, Chair. Sorry to come in there. What we can do is, just picking up on what you said first of all there, Chair, if we get those details out to yourself, the presentation, you should have copies of it and we can get those out, and the links to the strategy and so forth. If we send out to you the current diagrams for the staffing levels and where we currently sit with those, I think it would be also useful if we sent out to you as well the current information that's out there for the public and other people, to point you to where it is, so you can see about comms, because I think you're right, that's going to become a big part. So that should then help you with when we come back and any questions you've got. And I say, if you've got your questions beforehand, please, if we can feed them through Kat, we'll try and get them answered so we can come back. I think then if we do what you said, Ted, if we can look out a couple of section 19s, either ones that are ongoing or ones that have actually happened, if we can send you the details on them because they've been published, and then when we come to talk about, as it says on the next section, the section 19 investigations, you guys will have read through them then, you'll have your questions, and we can then talk you through what actually happened on those examples and where it led to. Now, we've got some that have been ongoing for about 3 or 4 years. So one of those is a very complicated and might be interesting example. And then we'll have one that's quite quick. So just to give you that different flavour, and then you'll understand more about the section 19s and where they end up, if that's okay.
Great, thank you.
Oh, good suggestions.
Very good. Yes. So anything else? Because I think that concludes the agenda for today, doesn't it?
That was me.
Oh, sorry, Sean. I've
Yeah.
missed you then. You were being a gentleman and going, and then I've missed you. So please go ahead.
It's just instinct, you know. If I'm chairing a meeting, I always try and take people in the right order. So I tend to do that when I'm waiting in the queue myself. Right. I think we ought to have to continue this discussion about the way we manage risk. I think we ought to have a little bit more about that at the next meeting. I don't want to ask you to write a paper or something like that, but just Googling very quickly. There is a local government association page on flood risk and flood risk management there with some reading for me to do and some links to further things. So I need to look at that myself, but I think it'd be useful to have an item on the agenda so we can discuss that. And I think we need to link to this leadership role. I mean, we can't embrace this leadership role by saying we haven't got any power and I'm afraid it's somebody else's responsibility. We ought to be in a position where we're actually showing some direction, and so that the other bodies will follow that and work in a coordinated way. That's where I want to move us to. And
so what we'll make sure, Sean, is section 7 of the current flood strategy is titled Strategic Objectives and Managing Local Flood Risk. So if we send that out to everyone as a section to read, that should help, because that's based on the Water Act, what the government wants us to do, and the framework in which we set, and it talks about the parts there. And then I think that's where we can have the discussion then about, okay, how could we do that better, different, your recommendations, you know, what are we doing or not? Because it'll also lead into then on the third meeting, if we can keep all that other stuff in the second one, on our roles and responsibilities and our relationships with the other bodies, which you want to examine. So that would nicely follow through then.
Yeah, that's fine. Just wanted something on the agenda for the next meeting so we can discuss that. I need to do some more reading on that, obviously.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Dan, I think you've got your hand up.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman. Ian, have we got a written policy of how we behave and coordinate with all the other agencies? Because when you talk of churn on the scale that you have, and I understand exactly why it is probably so, but you know, if one person has got a good knack and he goes or she goes, you know, have we got proper policy and development of a policy? This is how we coordinate. These are relationships that are set, solid, and not just upon somebody who turns up who's very good at meeting people and somebody who's a brilliant engineer but really isn't very bit shy. You know, we've got to have some policy formatting, haven't we? Because if we're an enabler with very little power than to open doors and have all these contacts, well, we've got to have a system that they're all there and we know who everybody is and we can deal with it. Thank you.
Okay, so I think two things there, picking up on what you said. One, with the churn on staff we've had, which has happened everywhere, is those working relationships, and people are people and they get on once they get to know each other, have been stretched, have been stressed. They've not been as we wanted them to be over the last few years because we've not been able to maintain them. That's what we'll be looking to bring back better now, such as the flood board, where we bring all these people together. I do think, as we're covering quite a lot more than was on the second meeting, we'll have to have a chat with Kat and yourself, Chair, to look at the agenda and see how we're going to cover that, because I think, you know, you could spend a whole 2-hour session on section 19, you could spend a whole 2-hour on the highways drainage. We'll probably need to look at how succinct that can be and how you can draw the information out to make the recommendations. So if that's okay. But you're right, Councillor Harrison, it's we do have set out how we should do these things. The problem we've had twofold, one with the staff churn, but also, as you can imagine, when we have these big flooding events, and we've had them one after another almost for the last 12 months, all the staff resource gets into that area immediately and other things don't happen. So that's where you'll look at recommendations for resource as well that you're considering as part of this and how we do business.
All right, thank you very much, Ian.
Thank you.
Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Harrison. I think you're right, Ian. I think we definitely need to look at the agenda for next time, because, I mean, it's a really interesting subject, and I think a lot of members of the public are taking a significant interest in it because of problems that they're experiencing at first hand. So that would be really good. If there's is that concluding the business if we've got nothing else? I would like to say, just before we close, thank you to Ian for the presentation. That was really enlightening, but also for the other officers that have joined us, although we've not heard from them very much, just to say I know they've been online and they've been listening to what we're saying. So hopefully next time we'll get their input going forward. So if there is nothing else for us to discuss on this meeting, I will declare the meeting closed and look forward to next time.
There's just one thing. I just need to discuss dates with members, but I'll just wait for the live stream to go off because that doesn't need to be on YouTube.